Welcome to Books and More, where we explore the ideas that shape our world and challenge the way we think about society, power, and progress. In today's episode, we dive into Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty, a groundbreaking work that redefines how we understand wealth, inequality, and the forces driving them. Through history, data, and moral insight, Piketty reveals how money shapes our future and what we must do to reclaim fairness and democracy. Stay tuned and let's uncover the truths behind modern capitalism together. Income and capital. In the opening part of Capital in the 21st Century, Thomas Piketty lays the foundation for understanding how income and capital have evolved throughout history and how their relationship defines the structure of inequality in modern societies. Speaking as both an economist and historian, Piketty insists that economics cannot be separated from politics, culture, or time. To understand wealth and inequality, one must look at centuries, not decades, at data, not ideology. The first part of the book introduces his core analytical tools, income, output, and capital, and reveals the long-term mechanisms that drive economic divergence. Piketty begins by defining income as the total flow of goods and services produced and distributed within a given year, and capital as the stock of all assets, real estate, financial holdings, industrial equipment, and intellectual property that generate wealth over time. He uses the term national income to describe the total annual income of a nation's citizens, including both labor income, wages and salaries, and capital income, profits, dividends, rents, and interest. This distinction is crucial because it shows how societies divide their wealth between those who work and those who own. He reminds us that while short-term fluctuations in GDP dominate public debate, the real story of economic inequality unfolds over centuries. From the 18th to the early 20th century, most Western societies were dominated by inherited wealth. The return on capital, symbolized by the formula R greater than G, meaning the rate of return on capital, R, exceeds the rate of economic growth, G, ensured that the rich grew richer faster than the economy expanded. Over time, this dynamic concentrated wealth in fewer hands, creating a self-reinforcing system of privilege. The Industrial Revolution did not fundamentally break this pattern, it merely changed its form. While production and technology expanded rapidly, ownership of capital remained concentrated. The bourgeois and aristocratic classes who owned factories, land, and financial institutions continued to accumulate wealth much faster than workers could through labor. Piketty explains that even when wages rose, they never matched the compounding power of capital returns. The rich, through investment and inheritance, perpetuated their advantage across generations. However, the 20th century brought disruption. The two world wars, economic depressions, and waves of nationalization destroyed much of the old wealth, temporarily reducing inequality. Taxation, inflation, and the expansion of welfare states redistributed income on an unprecedented scale. For the first time, societies like France, Britain, and the United States saw a decline in inherited wealth's dominance. Merit, education, and innovation seemed to replace birth as the main drivers of success. Yet, as Piketty warns, this period, roughly from 1945 to 1975, was an exception, not a rule. It was the product of extraordinary historical circumstances, not a permanent transformation of capitalism. In the chapter on growth, illusions, and realities, Piketty examines why growth alone cannot solve inequality. He dismantles the myth that modern economies naturally evolve toward equality. Instead, he argues that growth is an anomaly, historically slow, rarely exceeding 1 to 2% per year over long periods. Population growth has historically been the main driver of expansion, not productivity or technology. When population stabilizes, as in many advanced countries today, the rate of growth slows further, making it almost inevitable that R greater than G reasserts itself. This imbalance allows the owners of capital to accumulate wealth faster than society can produce new income, leading once again to a concentration of economic power. Piketty uses extensive historical data to support his argument, comparing national accounts from France, the United Kingdom, and the United States from the 18th century onward. His meticulous analysis reveals striking similarities. Wherever the return on capital outpaces growth, inequality deepens. Even in different cultural and political contexts, the laws of accumulation remain consistent. The wealthiest 1%, he shows, consistently capture a disproportionate share of income, not because they work harder or innovate more, but because the structure of capital allows wealth to reproduce itself. This leads to one of Piketty's central insights. Capitalism, left to its own devices, does not tend toward balance, but toward divergence. The system inherently favors capital over labor, ownership over effort, and inheritance over innovation. The result is not meritocracy, but a form of patrimonial capitalism where economic power is transmitted across generations like hereditary titles once were. In such a system, democracy itself is endangered, as economic inequality translates into political influence. To make this dynamic clear, Piketty introduces two key ratios. The capital/income ratio, beta, equals K over Y, representing the total value of a society's capital, K, relative to its annual income, Y. When this ratio is high, wealth dominates production, signaling a capital-heavy economy. The rate of return on capital, R, showing how fast wealth grows compared to the economy as a whole. When R greater than G, the concentration of wealth accelerates. Historically, the capital/income ratio hovered around 6 or 7 before World War I, meaning national wealth equaled roughly 6 to 7 years of national income. After the wars, it fell to about 2 or 3, but by the early 21st century, it had returned to its old levels. This resurgence marks the return of the rentier society, where those who own assets earn more than those who work. Piketty's tone throughout this section is analytical but tinged with moral urgency. He does not condemn wealth itself, but the unchecked accumulation that erodes social cohesion. The dominance of capital over labor, he argues, is not the product of fate, but of policy. Taxation, inheritance laws, education systems, and financial regulation all determine how inequality evolves. Capitalism is not inherently unjust, but without deliberate intervention, it drifts toward oligarchy. He also challenges the optimistic belief that technological innovation can offset inequality. While innovation increases productivity, it rarely redistributes ownership. The digital age, for instance, has created vast new fortunes but also intensified concentration, as global tech giants command unprecedented influence over both markets and information. The same logic of R greater than G applies. Wealth begets more wealth, especially when capital takes intangible forms like data and algorithms. In conclusion, Piketty's first part establishes the central theme of his work, that the relationship between income and capital determines the fate of societies. The 20th century's relative equality was an exception, born of crisis, not a sustainable equilibrium. In the long run, unless structural reforms are implemented, capitalism will revert to its natural tendency toward inequality. To prevent this, nations must rethink fiscal policy, inheritance taxation, and education, not to destroy wealth, but to prevent it from devouring democracy. This section leaves the reader with a sobering realization. Inequality is not an accident, nor is it inevitable. It is a choice, a political and institutional outcome shaped by how societies decide to distribute the fruits of growth. By uncovering the mechanisms that link income and capital, Piketty sets the stage for the rest of the book, a global inquiry into how humanity can balance prosperity with justice in the 21st century. The dynamics of the capital/income ratio. In the second part of Capital in the 21st Century, Thomas Piketty takes the reader deep into the mechanics of wealth accumulation and the long-term dynamics that govern the relationship between capital and income. Here, his focus shifts from simple inequality to the structural forces that make inequality persistent and self-reinforcing. He traces the historical metamorphosis of capital, showing how its form, function, and ownership have evolved from the feudal age to the present. Through meticulous data and moral reflection, Piketty paints a portrait of capitalism as a system that, without regulation, naturally drives societies back toward high levels of inequality, much like those that existed before the 20th century's great disruptions. The section opens with The Metamorphosis of Capital, where Piketty explains that capital has always existed, but its composition has changed dramatically. In pre-industrial societies, land was the dominant form of wealth, tying economic power to hereditary privilege. With industrialization came machinery, infrastructure, and later financial assets, forms of capital that could be accumulated, traded, and multiplied faster than land. Yet the underlying principle remained: capital generates income, and those who own it can reinvest and compound their advantage. The story of modern capitalism, in Piketty's view, is not one of liberation from old hierarchies, but of their transformation into more sophisticated, financialized forms. He emphasizes that the illusion of meritocracy conceals a deep continuity between the old aristocracies and today's elite. The bourgeois industrialists and financial magnates who replaced the landed nobility did not dismantle the logic of capital, they perfected it. Ownership shifted from castles and estates to stocks and portfolios, but the concentration of wealth persisted. Even as societies proclaimed equality of opportunity, the fundamental inequality of capital ownership endured, passed not through bloodlines, but through inheritance, education, and access to financial markets. In From Old Europe to the New World, Piketty compares the evolution of capital across continents. Europe, with its ancient aristocracies, experienced centuries of concentrated wealth before wars and revolutions disrupted it. The United States, by contrast, began as a society of settlers with less inherited inequality. For a time, the New World seemed to embody opportunity and social mobility. Yet, as Piketty shows, this was only temporary. As industrial and financial capital accumulated, wealth concentration in America rose rapidly, creating its own dynasties, the Rockefellers, Carnegies, and modern-day billionaires, whose influence now rivals the old European elites. Capital, in essence, reproduces the same inequalities wherever it goes, adapting to local institutions but obeying universal laws of accumulation. The core of Part 2 lies in the chapter The Capital/Income Ratio Over the Long Run, where Piketty introduces one of his most powerful analytical tools, the ratio of total capital, K, to annual national income, Y. This ratio, beta equals K over Y, measures how much wealth a society has relative to its production. A high beta indicates that capital plays a dominant role in generating income. In other words, that the rich control more of the economy's output simply because they own its assets. Historically, Piketty demonstrates beta was extremely high in 18th and 19th century Europe, around 6 to 7, fell sharply after the World Wars and the Great Depression to around 2 or 3, and has since climbed back to its former levels in the 21st century. This rebound signifies the return of patrimonial capitalism, where wealth inherited from the past outweighs the income earned through labor. Why did this happen? Piketty attributes it to the slowdown in population and economic growth. When growth, G, is low, but the return on capital, R, remains high, wealth accumulates faster than income expands, the famous inequality R greater than G. This simple but devastating inequality explains why inequality intensifies over time. In periods of strong growth, such as the post-war boom, this effect is mitigated because income rises broadly, but when growth slows, the concentration of wealth accelerates. Today's combination of sluggish growth and booming financial markets, Piketty warns, mirrors the conditions of the 19th century, a time when inherited wealth ruled and social mobility was minimal. The chapter, The Capital-Labor Split in the 21st Century, explores how income is divided between labor, wages, and capital, profits. Piketty dismantles the comforting belief that technological progress and education naturally increase labor's share. Instead, he shows that the share of capital income has been steadily rising for decades, even in advanced economies. Globalization, automation, and the weakening of labor institutions have tilted the balance toward capital owners. In a world where robots replace workers and corporations move capital freely across borders, the bargaining power of labor diminishes. The result is a structural drift back toward rentier capitalism, a system where income increasingly derives from ownership rather than work. Piketty provides concrete evidence for this shift. In countries like the United States, the share of income from capital, dividends, rents, and capital gains has surged since the 1980s, while median wages stagnated. The same pattern holds in Europe and Japan. The global rise of supermanagers, corporate executives whose salaries are tied to stock performance, further blurs the line between labor and capital, creating a hybrid elite that captures both forms of income. Yet, as Piketty notes, this apparent meritocracy often disguises rent-seeking behavior. High executive pay reflects control over corporate governance, not superior productivity. The outcome is the same as in the past. Wealth reproduces itself, insulated from the moral justification of work. Throughout Part 2, Piketty integrates quantitative rigor with moral clarity. He is not content to describe economic laws. He asks what kind of society they produce. The return of high capital/income ratios, he warns, threatens to undermine the democratic ideals that emerged in the 20th century. When the rate of return on wealth systematically exceeds the rate of growth, inherited fortunes dominate and opportunity declines. This is not merely an economic issue, but a political one. When capital becomes too powerful, it captures institutions, shapes laws, and dictates policy. The invisible hand of the market becomes the iron grip of the wealthy. Piketty's historical perspective is central to his argument. He demonstrates that the egalitarian era following World War II was not the product of capitalism's natural evolution, but of violent shocks, wars, inflation, and progressive taxation that destroyed large fortunes. Once stability returned, inequality began to rise again, proving that without continued intervention, capitalism reverts to concentration. The apparent equilibrium of the mid-20th century was thus a historical anomaly, not a sustainable model. Today's globalized digital capitalism has restored the logic of accumulation, but with a new twist. Wealth is no longer confined within national borders. Capital now moves instantaneously across the planet, seeking the highest returns, while governments struggle to tax or regulate it. This mobility makes inequality harder to control and more dangerous than ever. Piketty also highlights how the shift from physical to financial and intangible assets changes the nature of inequality. In the past, land and factories tied wealth to specific locations, making it visible and taxable. Modern wealth, stocks, patents, data, offshore accounts, is abstract and mobile, evading national laws and democratic oversight. The concentration of such assets creates an economy that is globalized at the top but fragmented below. The ultra-wealthy live in a borderless world of capital flows, while ordinary citizens remain bound by national economies and stagnant wages. The result is a deepening disconnect between the rich and the rest, between the global and the local. In his conclusion to Part 2, Piketty makes a crucial observation. Capitalism contains within it the seeds of its own destabilization. The logic of R greater than G is not only economically unsustainable, but socially explosive. As wealth piles up in the hands of a small elite, the legitimacy of the system erodes. History shows that such imbalances eventually lead to political upheaval, revolutions, wars, or crises. Piketty's warning is not apocalyptic but analytical. If societies fail to address the structural forces driving inequality, they will face instability far greater than any market correction.
He ends with a moral reflection that sets the tone for the rest of the book. Economic growth and innovation are valuable, but they are not sufficient. Without mechanisms to ensure that wealth serves society rather than dominating it, democracy itself is at risk. The dynamics of the capital/income ratio, he concludes, are not immutable laws of nature. They are the product of human institutions, tax systems, educational policies, social norms, and can therefore be changed. But to change them, societies must first see them clearly. Part 2 thus transforms abstract equations into a vivid moral narrative, the struggle between growth and accumulation, between democracy and patrimony, between the future and the past. It is not simply a lesson in economics, but a meditation on power, how it shifts, hides, and endures through capital. And it sets the stage for Piketty's deeper exploration in the following parts: how inequality takes shape, how it corrodes societies, and what can be done to reclaim the promise of equality in the 21st century.
The structure of inequality. In Part 3 of Capital in the 21st Century, Thomas Piketty turns from the macroeconomic mechanisms of growth and accumulation to the anatomy of inequality itself, how wealth and income are distributed among individuals and how these structures evolve. Speaking with the measured authority of both a historian and moral economist, Piketty dissects inequality into its two fundamental forms: inequality of labor income and inequality of capital ownership. He argues that understanding these two dimensions and how they interact over time is essential to grasping the future of modern capitalism. The section begins with inequality and concentration, preliminary bearings. Here, Piketty sets out to define the architecture of inequality. He distinguishes between functional inequality, the division between labor and capital, and individual inequality, the differences between people within those groups. Even when the share of labor income in national output remains stable, individual disparities within labor can widen sharply. Thus, one must look beyond aggregate statistics to the distributional layers underneath. Piketty notes that the top decile, and especially the top 1%, have consistently captured a disproportionate share of income in most societies. This pattern is not random, but structural, arising from institutional, fiscal, and cultural choices that favor capital accumulation and high compensation at the top. In Two Worlds, Piketty explores the contrast between the societies of labor and those of capital, between people who live from wages and those who live from wealth. In the 19th century, these worlds were almost separate. Today, they overlap, but only partially. The globalization of markets and the expansion of education have blurred boundaries, creating the illusion of meritocracy. Yet, he shows that in both Europe and the United States, wealth inequality has reached levels reminiscent of pre-war societies. While a small share of the population controls vast fortunes, the middle class, which emerged briefly in the mid-20th century, faces stagnation. The two worlds of income and wealth have reappeared, and with them the old social hierarchies that democracy once sought to dissolve. The following chapters, Inequality of Labor Income and Inequality of Capital Ownership, form the analytical core of this part. In the former, Piketty traces the evolution of wage inequality since the Industrial Revolution. For most of history, wages were compressed by both technological limits and social constraints. Productivity gains were slow and mobility was rare. The 20th century, however, brought a dramatic transformation. The rise of mass education, unionization, and progressive taxation narrowed income gaps in the mid-century decades, creating the illusion that capitalism could sustain equality through growth. But since the 1980s, that trend has reversed. Globalization, automation, and the weakening of collective bargaining have driven up income at the top while leaving median wages stagnant. In the United States, the share of total income earned by the top 10% returned to pre-World War I levels by 2010. The supermanager phenomenon, where corporate executives capture enormous compensation tied to stock performance, symbolizes this shift. These incomes are often justified as rewards for merit, yet Piketty argues that they largely reflect power within firms rather than productivity. The next chapter, Inequality of Capital Ownership, reveals the far deeper inequality that lies in the distribution of wealth.
Capital ownership is vastly more concentrated than labor income and changes more slowly over time. Piketty shows that in every country with sufficient data, the top 10% own between 60 and 90% of all wealth, while the bottom half own almost nothing. This imbalance is self-perpetuating. Capital generates income, which can be reinvested, amplifying disparities across generations. In contrast to wages, which fluctuate with labor markets, wealth compounds. Thus, even if income inequality were stable, wealth inequality would keep rising. Piketty argues that this dynamic explains the resilience of patrimonial capitalism, a system where economic power flows not from effort or innovation, but from ownership and inheritance.
In Merit and Inheritance in the Long Run, Piketty delves into the moral and historical dimensions of this phenomenon. He revisits the 19th century world depicted by Balzac and Austen, a society where inheritance determined destiny. In that era, the annual flow of inherited wealth often equaled or exceeded national savings, meaning that more wealth came from the dead than from the living. The 20th century briefly disrupted this inheritance society through war, inflation, and taxation, but by the early 21st century, inheritance flows in Europe had rebounded to levels approaching those of 1900. Piketty calls this the return of patrimonial capitalism. He argues that the dream of a merit-based society where success comes from skill and effort is being eroded by the quiet resurgence of inheritance as the main determinant of wealth. He examines the forces behind this return: slower population growth, lower economic growth, and high returns on capital. When fewer new fortunes are created through entrepreneurship and growth, old fortunes persist. Even in the United States, once thought to be a nation of self-made individuals, inherited wealth has regained importance. While some billionaires are entrepreneurs, many are heirs of previous generations, and the line between innovation and inheritance has blurred. The meritocratic extremism of modern society, the belief that all inequality is deserved, thus conceals the reality of inherited privilege. Piketty warns that without strong policy intervention, the 21st century will look increasingly like the 19th, with economic elites dominating through accumulated wealth rather than productive contribution. The final chapter of Part 3, Global Inequality of Wealth in the 21st Century, extends the analysis beyond national borders. Piketty argues that globalization has not reduced inequality but reshaped it. While global growth has lifted millions out of poverty, wealth has become increasingly concentrated among the global elite. The richest individuals, corporations, and sovereign wealth funds hold assets across borders, blurring distinctions between nations. A French billionaire may own factories in China. A Saudi fund may hold vast shares in American companies. Capital has become global, while regulation remains national. This asymmetry allows wealth to escape taxation and accountability, accelerating the concentration of power. Piketty also introduces the idea of unequal returns on capital. Wealthy investors with access to better information and financial tools consistently earn higher returns than small savers. Thus, even if everyone saved at the same rate, inequality would still grow. Financial globalization amplifies this by rewarding scale and mobility. The rich can diversify, arbitrage, and shelter assets across jurisdictions, while ordinary citizens cannot. The consequence is a self-reinforcing global hierarchy where the top decile gains not only from ownership, but from superior returns on their wealth. He examines two other dimensions of global inequality, between countries and within them. While emerging economies like China have grown rapidly, reducing the income gap with the West, internal inequalities have surged. A small elite captures much of the new wealth, mirroring patterns in developed economies. Piketty foresees a future where the world's richest, regardless of nationality, share more in common with each other than with their fellow citizens. The global financial elite forms a transnational class, united by assets, not allegiance. Throughout Part 3, Piketty's tone alternates between analytical precision and moral urgency. He insists that inequality is not an accident, but a logical outcome of capitalist dynamics.
The forces that once compressed inequality, high growth, progressive taxation, and social democracy, are weakening, while the engines of concentration are roaring back to life. He rejects both fatalism and complacency. Inequality is not the price of progress, but a distortion of it. A society that allows wealth to compound without check eventually sacrifices merit, mobility, and democracy itself. The section concludes by framing inequality as both an economic and ethical challenge. Piketty reminds us that distribution is not merely a matter of efficiency, but of justice. When wealth becomes too concentrated, it distorts politics, erodes trust, and undermines the social contract. The promise of capitalism, that hard work leads to prosperity, collapses when returns to capital far exceed returns to labor. The structure of inequality thus reveals the moral paradox of modern capitalism, a system that creates immense wealth but distributes it ever more unevenly. In essence, Part 3 transforms Piketty's theory of R over G into human terms, into stories of inheritance, privilege, and lost opportunity. It portrays a world where the mechanisms of inequality have become more complex, more global, and more deeply rooted in the very structure of the economy. Yet it also implies that these mechanisms are human creations and therefore subject to human reform. By exposing the hidden architecture of inequality, Piketty invites his readers not only to understand it, but to question the legitimacy of the system that sustains it. His voice is that of both scholar and citizen, rigorous in analysis, yet guided by a belief that knowledge can still lead to justice. Part 3, then, is not merely a diagnosis. It is a moral map of our time, a mirror reflecting how far the modern world has drifted from its democratic ideals, and a warning that without deliberate correction, the 21st century may become a new golden age for inherited wealth and a dark age for equality.
Regulating capital in the 21st century. In the final part of Capital in the 21st Century, Thomas Piketty turns from diagnosis to prescription, from describing how inequality emerges to confronting the question of what can be done about it. After tracing centuries of wealth concentration and explaining the mechanics of RI, the tendency for capital to grow faster than income, Piketty argues that unregulated capitalism inevitably undermines democracy. The fourth part, Regulating Capital in the 21st Century, is therefore a call to action, a blueprint for restoring balance between markets, the state, and social justice. Through a blend of economic history, data, and moral reasoning, Piketty outlines how taxation, education, and global cooperation can prevent the return of a hereditary aristocratic of wealth. The section begins with Chapter 13, A Social State for the 21st Century, where Piketty re-examines the role of the modern welfare state. He argues that the great social achievements of the 20th century, public education, healthcare, pensions, and income redistribution, were not accidents or temporary reliefs, but the foundation of democratic capitalism. These institutions transformed the industrial world into a more equal society and fueled both economic growth and social stability. The welfare state, in his view, was the most effective response to the crises of the early 1900s, 2 world wars and the Great Depression, which exposed the dangers of unrestrained capital. However, Piketty insists that the social state must evolve rather than stagnate. The challenges of the 21st century, globalization, aging populations, and technological disruption demand new forms of redistribution. He envisions a social state of knowledge, one that invests heavily in education and lifelong learning as the modern equivalent of land reform or industrial policy. For him, equality of opportunity begins not with charity, but with public investment in human capital. A well-educated citizenry, protected by social safety nets, creates a more productive and fair economy. The question, then, is not whether we can afford a strong welfare state, but whether we can afford to lose it. Without collective investment in people, inequality will only deepen, eroding the foundations of democracy itself. In Chapter 14, Rethinking the Progressive Income Tax, Piketty revisits one of the most powerful instruments of equality, progressive taxation. He recounts how the progressive tax emerged during the early 20th century as a response to war and social upheaval. In the United States and Europe, top income tax rates once exceeded 70 or even 90%, curbing excessive accumulation and financing public goods. Far from harming growth, these taxes coincided with the most prosperous decades in history. But since the 1980s, tax competition among nations and the ideological rise of neoliberalism have dismantled the system. Top tax rates have fallen dramatically, while capital gains and corporate income often go untaxed or hidden in havens. Piketty dismantles the myth that low taxes on the wealthy promote innovation or efficiency. Instead, he argues, they encourage rent-seeking, speculation, and political capture. When executives and financiers accumulate fortunes not through productivity, but through favorable tax treatment, meritocracy collapses. The explosion of executive pay since the 1980s, particularly in the United States, illustrates this perverse dynamic. Piketty urges a return to steeply progressive taxes on very high incomes, not out of envy, but out of necessity. Such taxes, he says, are a democratic institution. They prevent the domination of politics by wealth and reaffirm that prosperity must serve the common good. The ideal society, he writes, is not one where entrepreneurs disappear, but one where they can exist without turning into oligarchs. Building on this, Chapter 15, A Global Tax on Capital, presents Piketty's most ambitious and controversial idea, a worldwide progressive tax on wealth. He calls it both a useful utopia and the only realistic solution to global inequality. The idea is simple but revolutionary. In a world where capital moves freely across borders, regulation must also be global. A progressive annual tax on net wealth, starting modestly at 0.1 or 0.5% for small fortunes and rising to several percent for billionaires, would serve not only to redistribute wealth, but to make it visible. Piketty emphasizes transparency as the moral foundation of his proposal. Without knowledge of who owns what, democracy cannot function. A global registry of assets, combined with automatic exchange of banking information, would expose the hidden architecture of wealth that now evades taxation. He concedes that such a system would require unprecedented cooperation, but he argues that history proves it is possible. Just as the nation-state once imposed rules on local markets, the global community must now regulate global capital. Europe, he suggests, could lead by example, creating a regional wealth tax that could later expand worldwide. The goal is not to punish wealth, but to prevent its concentration from reaching destructive levels. Piketty draws a parallel with environmental regulation. Just as unchecked industrial activity destroys the planet, unchecked financial accumulation corrodes society. Both require collective action and moral clarity. At the heart of this vision lies the conviction that economic knowledge must serve democracy. Piketty believes that inequality thrives in secrecy. Tax havens, opaque corporate structures, and financial derivatives allow capital to hide and multiply without accountability. By making wealth transparent, societies can reclaim control over their destinies. The global capital tax, then, is not merely an economic instrument, but a political one, a way to reassert democratic sovereignty over the market. Finally, Chapter 16, The Question of the Public Debt, addresses one of the great obsessions of modern politics, the fear of government debt. Piketty argues that this fear is often exaggerated and misused to justify austerity policies that hurt the poor while protecting the wealthy. Public debt, he explains, is not inherently bad. What matters is who owns it and how it is financed. When governments borrow from the rich, they transfer wealth upward through interest payments. When they tax the rich instead, they redistribute wealth downward, reducing inequality. He reminds readers that much of the debt accumulated by European nations and the United States after World War II was effectively eroded by inflation and growth, not by austerity, but by investment and expansion. Piketty challenges the orthodoxy that insists on balanced budgets at all costs. He advocates for moderate public debt as a tool for social investment in education, infrastructure, and green technologies.
Instead of cutting spending, societies should ensure that those who benefit most from globalization contribute their fair share. Progressive taxation on wealth and inheritance can fund these investments, creating a virtuous cycle of growth and equity. In his view, the real danger is not fiscal irresponsibility, but moral irresponsibility, a politics that sacrifices the future to protect the privileges of the few. Throughout Part 4, Piketty's voice is both rational and visionary. He does not imagine a utopia without markets or private property, but a capitalism disciplined by democracy. His solutions are bold, but grounded in historical precedent. Progressive taxation, public education, social insurance, and global cooperation have all worked before. The challenge is to renew them for the digital, financialized, and globalized world of today. He insists that inequality is not the natural outcome of economics, but the result of political choices, and that better choices are possible.
In conclusion, regulating capital in the 21st century is a manifesto for the moral renewal of capitalism. Piketty envisions a world where wealth serves humanity rather than enslaves it, where transparency replaces secrecy, and where democratic societies reclaim their right to shape the economy. He acknowledges that these reforms will face resistance from entrenched interests, but he argues that the alternative, rising inequality, social unrest, and democratic decay, is far more dangerous. The tone of the final pages is one of cautious hope. Piketty does not claim that history guarantees progress, only that it offers lessons. The great social advances of the past, from the abolition of slavery to universal suffrage and social welfare, were once dismissed as impossible. So too, he suggests, will future generations view global taxation, economic transparency, and the end of patrimonial capitalism as milestones in the long struggle for justice. The task of the 21st century is to make capitalism compatible with democracy once again, and for that, knowledge, courage, and collective will are humanity's greatest tools.